Hello, and this is the video lecture in the Struggle for Democracy for the SSC 120 students in American national government. And this chapter is one of our video lectures, and it covers social movements. We have our usual 10 study guide questions that I will cover during our lecture. There's no essay for this one, so you can do your no essay dance right now. Yay! Demanding the right to vote. So social movements are typically a group of people who feel they need something from government and aren't getting it the normal way, the preferred way, the established way. In this case, women working hard to get the right to vote. It took a long time, over 100 years, but finally happened in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. So these are typically people on the outside using grassroots, populated with people that are connected on some sort of grievance, not averse to using unconventional tactics, and they, if they're successful, will turn into an interest group. So here is one. These are populist farmers from Minnesota. And the reality is farmers did not protest all that much. So really tough economic times caused this to occur. So we're going to look at a whole variety of movements, spend a little bit of time on each one, and then we'll close with the farm to table movement. The Occupy Wall Street movement, number 40, I'll do that one now. What sparked the Occupy Wall Street movement? And that was the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009. The Great Recession of 2008, 2009. So let's start with the abolitionist movement. This is a group of people that felt strongly slavery was not handled in the Constitution. So they had anti-slavery demonstrations, and some sought violently to stop the Fugitive Slave Act. Another is the populist movement, and that's number 38. And when did the populist movement occur? It happened in the late 19th century, so the late 1800s, 80s and 90s. It was disaffected farmers, as you saw in the picture earlier, mostly from the South and West. And it was aimed to force public ownerships of banks and railroads who were gobbling up farmers' land. They did have success. They grabbed control of some state legislative houses, and they were able to help William Jennings Bryan get nominated for President of the United States, charismatic speaker. I believe he lost the election of 1896. The women's suffrage movement, finally successful in the 19th Amendment in 1920, they deliberately used unsettling and disruptive tactics. The labor movement, which had been around in various forms in Europe and in the United States, were militant in the 80s and 90s, and eventually, then again in the 1930s, it was all about the right to unionize to get better working conditions, wages, and benefits. In 2015, about 6% of America's workers are in unions. I'm in the public sector is where I work, and we have almost always have unions. The civil rights movement, born out of that 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment from the Civil War. The movement really came to life in the 1950s, and it's one of our most successful social movements. The NAACP is a good example of that. Number 36, what town did federal troops occupy in 1957 to integrate public schools? And Ike Eisenhower nationalized the Arkansas Guard, and they successfully integrated public schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. I was fortunate enough to meet one of the Little Rock 8 and hear their story. It was very, very moving. The other is number 39, and what primary tactic was advocated by Mahatma Gandhi and then emulated by Martin Luther King Jr. And that tactic, civil disobedience. the sit-in strike, the organized kind of peaceful strike, but it's nonviolent civil disobedience. The end of the civil rights movement came when its leaders started to die, including John Kennedy, his brother, Martin Luther King, and eventually the rise of Black power advocates who really looked at, like the Black Panthers, who were looking at more violent solutions. So here's the timeline. 1961 to 64 is the big key to that movement. Some other movements, we've had anti-war movements. Now, we had anti-war movements in World War I. Woodrow Wilson got elected saying that he would not get us into World War I. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, frankly, did not want to get into World War II. So in Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, we had a small presence, and thanks to Congress passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, the president started building more and more troops. We never declared war, but we had hundreds of thousands of troops in Vietnam. And that anti war movement was when I was growing up, and they used a variety of tactics, particularly mass demonstration. The fringe elements of the Vietnam protest movement were violent. Iraq, a protest that started with demonstrations in 2003, began prior to the Iraq invasion, but it lost steam once we invaded. So here are the worldwide demonstrations against the invasion of Iraq. The women's movement, as we've mentioned before, civil rights, protection for women, broaden the participation of women in society, economics, and politics. Question number 37. What is the ultimate goal of the women's movement that they failed to get past in the 1970s? And that is the ERA Amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment, a constitutional amendment to have women's rights equal. And it had momentum for a long time, but fell 3 states short of passage before the amendment timed out. The environmental movement began in the 70s with increased regulation of harmful environmental activities, raising public awareness. Again, the fringe of the environmental movement was some peace advocates that were very violent and used ecoterrorism. The gay and lesbian movements, LBGQT, extending civil rights as we did to women and African Americans. A lot of pushback from religious conservatives who feel gay and lesbian activity is a heinous sin. Their tactics have been fairly successful, particularly their legal tactics. And when the Defense of Marriage Act was passed, and that's number 31. What key provisions from the Defense of Marriage Act that the Supreme Court, that's SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States, overturned? What they overturned was denying same-sex couples federal benefits. And that was the thing that Supreme Court turned down and eventually led to a universal permission for same-sex marriage. Religious conservatives have been a movement for a long time, but really prevalent in the 90s when they had a major public policy infusion. They had a set of rights that they worked out with a legislative caucus. Their major concern has been outlawing abortion and the Roe v. Wade decision. They're especially influential in the Republican Party. And number 33 asks, what is the most common example of secularization, the secularizing of society? And that is prayer in school. So that's something religious conservatives are very upset about, that taking prayer out of public schools. The anti-globalization movement, one that never really got off the ground in the United States. It's an extremely diverse group, and it opposes free trade. Here's anarchists, basically no government, and confronting police. They love to go to places like the G8, the Big 8 Economy Summit, and other large government confluations. The Tea Party movement, very powerful, very angry. So it's like populism on angry steroids. Deeply conservative, no new taxes. It's now a major force in the Republican Party. They're also staunch on anti immigration. Here's a picture. We will vote you out. Now, part of teed off is a difficulty. They put people in power that aren't allowed to vote for any tax increase, when in fact, increasing taxes a small bit in certain areas would actually be quite helpful. Here's Tea Party issues: smaller government, government is wasteful, corporations make a fair profit, so very few prefer bigger government, for example. The Occupy Wall Street movement, again, number 40. We are the 99, and it's all about the fact that economically, the top 1% owns a large amount of our economy and has prospered even through the recession, the Great Recession of 08, 09. And many younger people with high college debts, struggling to find a meaningful job, said, "We are the 99, pay attention." They organized almost exclusively through social media, and they really harped on economic unfairness. And Bernie Sanders benefited from this movement. Here they are cleaning up occupational hazards. So part of Occupy Wall Street was the power of community working together. Black Lives Matter, kind of a more modern extension of the civil rights movement, started as a hashtag campaign, grassroots, highly decentralized. I know when I visit Columbus for my meetings, there are many neighborhoods where Black Lives Matter or rainbow signs are often out on sometimes a quarter or half of the houses on a street. Here's a picture. We are not a throwaway race. Black Lives Matter. Social movements in a democracy. Well, their goal, their role, is to encourage more participation from people who feel shut out and to really get after some political inequalities. They often create newer majorities and overcome what I'd call constitutional inertia. That is, the Constitution is a fixed document, doesn't change that quickly. You got to nudge it to make it go forward. So it typically takes outsiders, and that puts them in a more increased interest in politics and increased involvement, and hopefully using public attention to broaden to the scope of the conflict that they are after. It's very much about mass mobilization using tactics that are social media oriented. It is, as some groups that are organized and well oiled machines would use money, more here, tweets and text. These new majorities, particularly after the Great Depression and the labor union, the women's movement, asking for pay inequity. So these created large support groups for particularly the Democratic Party. The constitutional inertia is social movements bring change. They help upset the status quo and they disrupt the business as usual. Factors that encourage this social movement says what must occur to get a social movement organized, and that is reason number one, a real or perceived distress. You also need some resources, a supportive environment, a sense of efficacy or connection amongst the participants, and then some type of factual spark to set off the flames, maybe a martyr for the cause or a specific event. The real or perceived distress does not need to be super intense. It can just be a spark. Economic, social, and technological change behind it, the Industrial Revolution, the Great Depression, and massive discrimination. These movements often inspire counter-movements back and forth, back and forth. Here is U.S. border. So the Tea Party is a very strong anti-immigration group, and here is self-proclaimed border enforcers. The availability of resources for mobilization, well, you need a pool of potential leaders. You need institutions that would be infrastructure, and typically that would be network broadcasting or tweeting or Facebooking. You need some money, typically faith-based or some social organization, and you need some consciousness-raising activity. The women's movement was really good at that. The timing must be right. Society must be sympathetic. Down deep, most society members understand this is wrong. We need to fix this. And the acceptance of some elites, like a person that is high end in the television industry or movie industry, or an athlete that is a spokesperson. So here is the women's movement and pushing feminism, and that's Gloria Steinem that you see sitting there, and three or four people around her that all went on to become famous feminists. Television with an attitude. This is an extra credit. What HBO series provided the LBGQT program with a strong platform for their issues, and that is Orange is the New Black. I've seen a few episodes. It's pretty entertaining. So it's called Orange is the New Black. A sense of efficacy. Most people believe that government will respond and public policy is made from decentralized and fragmented sources, and just a sense of common identity that we're working on this together. The spark could be a precipitating event. For example, Rosa Parks refusing to sit on the back of the bus. The tactics, well, number 32, what are the common tactics of social movements? And number one, unconventional. So they also use sit-down strikes, civil disobedience, unconventional tactics don't always work. And then in terms of spreading it today, how do recent social movements spread their information? Well, clearly through social networking, texting, and other phone-driven media platforms. Here's the birthplace of a new tactic. These are a group of men in a plant for a car. They kind of grabbed the car and turned it into a demonstration. Here's Courage Under Fire with the fire department hosing down particular people that are protesting. Why do some succeed? Some are low impact, some are repressed, some partial, some successful. Well, typically, a low impact is typically people from the lower socioeconomic status and income, and they're looking for a radical redistribution, a lot of change, and it just doesn't get anywhere. The ERA is a good example. Social movement moving along looks like it's headed to ratification, but the religious conservative movement comes along and kind of undoes their progress, and they stall, again, 3 states short of passing an amendment. Changing threats to powerful interests. So if you arouse political hostility, for example, active strike breaking, and there's a Ludlow example here from Colorado where there was violence in the strike breaking group, and it was very, very difficult. So here is the Ludlow massacre from 1914. So hired guns coming in to go after Colorado miners. Partially successful, kind of half-hearted. So Franklin Roosevelt, for example, started Social Security, great program, but it's never quite been enough for people to be able to retire. Reagan appointed pro-life judges, but failed to support the legislation behind it. Christian conservatives have had some success, but we're not a theocracy. It's hard to legislate religion. Keys to successful social movement: building a support base and having public sympathy. Don't really challenge the heart of the economic and social order, kind of work around it, and wield some electoral count, some city, county, occasionally state level. So the women's suffrage movement, civil rights, same-sex marriage, and Hillary Clinton's nomination are all examples of successful social movements. So the interactive exercise for this chapter is the farm to table. And if you look at the history of the farm to table, it started in the 40s and 50s, but really kicked off when Alice Waters, a champion of a local sustainable agriculture, opened up the legendary Chez Panisse. And Chez Panisse is one of your questions. It is basically that restaurant, Chez Panisse, as one of the first farm to table. If you look at Farm to Table here in Ohio, we think highly of it and have a Farm to Table restaurant guide in Toledo, our closest large city. It's the Fowl and Fodder restaurant. So you get asked Toledo's Farm to Table, it's the Fowl and Fodder. That's all I've got. So I've gotten through the study guide questions. There were 3 extra credit questions, and I hope this has been helpful as we've covered Chapter 8 Social Movements.